Hi everybody, it's Grandmama with another story from our Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Here we go. There is a region west of Puget Sound where the growth of cities is miraculous and the waters of the Pacific come rushing through the gap in the coastline to make one of the finest harbors in the Pacific coast. This region is known as Grays Harbor County, beyond which there can be no further progress, for it borders on the Pacific Ocean. It is one of the richest lands in all the West. Pretty high-sounding description of our little patch of salty marsh, but that's how it looked to people in Minneapolis and St. Paul when those words were written 59 years ago. But that's the middle of the story. In a moment, we'll turn the pages of the Hometown Scrapbook back to the beginning and let you in on a yarn that's been spun many times before, but I bet you don't remember half of it. The first story in our Hometown Scrapbook, and the one that I never tire of telling, is the story of how there came to be a city on Grays Harbor, how they got their names, and what the people were like who racked the clearing in all the tall tree-covered wilderness to set about the business of living here. The story can start in a lot of places. It might begin with William O'Leary, the hermit of South Bay, who was the first white man to call this home. It could start with a settlement at Westport, and the city they called Leo City, or the land swap that a young Scotch farmer made with his father-in-law. It could start a lot of places. But when I tell you this yarn, I like to start with one of its principals, a young engineering cadet from the Aberdeen Military Academy in Virginia. His name was David Fleet. Young David belonged to a generation of Americans whose lives had been tossed into a lap of fortune by the bitter war between the states. The gracious southern life into which he had been born was swept away. Friends and relatives were dead and gone. When he was old enough to strike out for himself, he headed west. The railroads were starting their track into the sunset, and there were plenty of jobs for young engineers. At the end of the line in September 1883, he found himself in Tacoma. It was a boom town, and there was talk of other boom towns in the hinterlands. From a long list, he selected Olympia and moved down to that city to try his luck. The trim, straight, kindly old man with keen eyes, white hair, whom I knew as Daddy Fleet, once told me they were having a convention of the Northwest promoters when I arrived in Olympia. Every one of them thought his boom town or his special project was the best of all. To hear them talk, you'd think that they'd have a New York City growing in the timber in a few weeks. Young David Fleet avoided most of them, but one man, C.M. Biles, was different than the rest. He had a very convincing way, but a nice way about him, Daddy Fleet said. He described his part of the new country as the richest timber stand on the face of the earth. You can stake out a timber claim there, Biles told the young engineer, and a rich man in 10 years. It sounded like music to be told. Dave Fleet decided to see what it looked like. His new friend was helpful in more than words. When Dave decided to see the timber belt, Biles introduced him to J.M. Hopkins, who was driving down to the place called Montesano in a buckboard wagon. There'll be one other passenger, Biles told him, Senator Watson of Pennsylvania, who represents syndicated timber buyers. They started early and drove until late. It was a warm autumn day, and the maples, here and there among the fir and spruce, were golden. Daddy Fleet recalled that there was talk of many things. When would Washington become a state? Where would the big city be? The one that would certainly grow beyond the rest. It was shadowy twilight when they rolled into a cluster of houses, and Biles gestured with his whip. "This," said Mr. Biles, "is Montesano." The next day was the 1st of October. David Fleet recalled it as one of the finest days that he had ever seen. It was like springtime that he had known back in Virginia. In this country, he decided, I'll make my home. In his later years, Fleet gave another reason for his choice of home. It was a long way from the nearest railroad. The years of roughing it, turmoil, struggle, and brawling frontier that grew up beside the steel rails had left him with a great longing for a quiet place, for a land where fields bloomed sweet and green, untainted by coal smoke and coughing engines, for a country like his own Virginia. The young engineer was soon at work. J.B. Dabney was one of the country's most ardent and successful promoters. 4 days after his arrival in Montesano, young Dave was laying out Biles and Dabney's addition to Montesano. He was doing his work with a surveyor's chain brought from Olympia and a compass furnished by the developers. When Montesano had been enlarged, Dave Fleet looked about him for the next thing. Campfire tales of his railroading days had told of the vast wealth in timber down Grays Harbor Way. Biles' stories of the famous forest had furnished his interest. Some of the senators and Senator Watson's side comments had pointed up the value of a chunk of timberland for a good solid start. So a week later, guided by R.H. Evans, an experienced timber cruiser, young Dave looked for a claim site. For a week, they trapped the water-soaked underbrush of Township 18, Range 8 of Chehalis County. Grays Harbor, as you know, was called Chehalis County in that long-ago time. They found nothing that Evans considered worth filing on. Having worked their way well back into the watershed of the Wenatchee River, Evans decided that the shortest way out would be to come down the Wishkah to the Chehalis and catch a river boat, Governor Newell, back to Montesano. In a dugout canoe that Evans had chased along the stream near the tidewaters and paddled downstream. Then one day, 2 weeks after leaving Montesano, they stopped at a big log house on the west bank of the river where Samuel Ben housed his growing family. That night they were guests under its shake roof, and Sam Ben talked of some plans of his own. Since boom towns began to sprout in Washington Territory, Sam Ben had viewed his pasture lands at the junction of the Wishkah and Chehalis rivers as a potential town site. It was level, it was on navigable waters, and that was the only way that folks could travel down this way. There was plenty of good mill sites to provide space for industry, and there were plenty of home sites for people who would come when the mill was built. Sam aired his views. "I may do it someday," he told the young surveyor. "I think that'll wait a while and see what Parsons does with his plot." W.S. Parson was a promoter who had obtained a 30-acre government lot on the east bank of the Wishkah River. In fact, this radio station stands on a piece of his land. He was already making plans for a town site, and the news that there was an engineer on hand at Sam Ben's house traveled fast. George Emerson was talking of doing something over near the mouth of the Hoquiam River, or another group of promoters were eyeing the site of the present town of Cosmopolis with considerable interest. Parsons wanted to be first. He hired the engineer with the request that he get started at once. There were things to procure in Montesano, drafting line ink, some instruments that had to come down from Olympia, but Fleet began his work at once, and on the 22nd of December, the clerk at the county seat in Montesano accepted the filing the plat of the city of Wishkah, Washington. No one was much surprised. Everyone expected a city to pop up down on Grays Harbor's salt water. While working on Parsons, Dave Fleet was staying with the Ben family. Here, he would take his notes after a hard day in the field, and by lamplight, often with Sam Ben standing at his elbow, he put down the blocks and lots in the new town site. When he was finished and ready for recording, Parson came to give him the final check over. He was proud of his new city. Fleet recalled it later. He wanted Sam Ben to share in the reflected glory. Plat his acreage of yours, Sam, he said. Make it Ben's addition to the city of Wishkah. I think I will, Sam Ben replied. I think I will. But before work could begin on Sam Ben's site, Fleet advised a survey of the rivers and sloughs. The engineers wanted to make sure that everything was favorable for a town site. Sam Ben helped. So did George Ben, the pioneer's eldest son. Parsons, too. He held the chain and drove stakes or rowed the boat. They sounded the river and the canals. From the top of what is now Think of Me Hill, they made a topographical survey. The tide levels were measured. When it was complete, Fleet made his report. The land is low, he said. It can be raised by borrowing from some of the hills for fill. Except for that, nature has done everything possible to make it a place for a city. Sam Ben didn't mince words either. Go to work as soon as you please, he said. The next day was Christmas 1883. Well, the rest of the story has to do with another phase of the town building. Dave Fleet was at work on New Year's Day 1884 shooting the very first lines for streets that were to be called Heron, Wishkah, Hume, and River. There were to be 53 blocks. It would run from Ben Street, adjoining the town of Wishkah, set to Broadway. From the waterfront, it would extend north to Market Street. It would be Ben's addition to Wishkah, Washington. Later in January, Sam Ben traveled to Owaka to visit B.A. Seberg, who managed the Aberdeen Packing Company, a firm of salmon packers. It was more than a casual visit for Ben, who included amongst his venture a small canning plant, the Washington Packing Company, located near the site of Junction City. Why don't you start a town of your own, Seberg wanted to know. Why tack your town onto Parsons? Start a town, call it Aberdeen. What? Sam answered. What Sam answered was never recorded, but the name Aberdeen kept coming back to him. Mrs. Jim Stewart, a neighbor up the river, had mentioned Aberdeen, but Sam had platted his town as an addition to one that already existed. There wasn't much point in starting another town right alongside the first one, particularly since the first one wasn't much more than a paper community. Then he came back from his journey. He mentioned the name to his surveyor. That's a good name, Fleet told him. I went to the Aberdeen Academy in Virginia. A few weeks later, the Portland Oregonian carried a notice that Sam Ben was planting a new town site on Grays Harbor. It was to be called Aberdeen. On the 16th of February, the plat was accepted in Montesano. That night, J.B. Dabney came down the harbor on the Governor Newell to buy 8 corner lots in this prospective town. And young Dave Fleet? Why, he went back to Montesano and settled down and married and raised a family. For more than half a century, he was one of Grays Harbor's most colorful and charming figures. A daughter, Mrs. E.K. Bishop, and a grandson, Ned Bishop, reside in Aberdeen as descendants of this pioneer surveyor. His son, Reuben Fleet, a distinguished flyer in the First World War, became more distinguished in the business world as the organizer and founder of the Consolidated Aircraft Company. Oh, there would have been a city here if all the characters of the story had never lived, but they did. And that's the story of Aberdeen. There have been many fights in this old town. Sailors with belaying pins have cracked many a skull, and the flying cocks of the hefty logging men have brightened up more than one scuffle. But the fightiest fight that I can tell about was one that happened in front of the Palm Dance House the night Charlie Johnson tangled with the skipper of the Roy Summers. If you're around tomorrow night, I'll tell you about that one. As we close tonight's story from a hometown scrapbook. Thank you for listening.